and welcome back to A Little Bit Forward. This is the show where we do not pretend to have the answers, but we are very intent on sharing interesting questions with you. Hopefully, questions that will help you think a little bit bigger and a little bit deeper about your life, your work, and the world that we live in. Today, we're going to be talking about this idea of structural problems and ad hoc solutions. And this was inspired by a post that I wrote recently. I'll share it in the show notes. And we're talking about this through the lens of strategic thinking. And for those who know about my work, this is obviously an area of deep interest for me. And when I look at organizations from the outside, I often see that our approaches to doing strategic thinking, to thinking bigger and more deeply about the world and the operating environment of our organization, is treated in a very ad hoc fashion. Yet the challenges that we face in that space are quite structural. And so what I mean by that, if we kind of look at organizations, there are a number of structural things that encourage us to think short term. So we have a weekly stand-up meeting, or we do quarterly reporting, or potentially we do an annual review of our performance. We have short-term incentive payments. We have all these things that encourage us to think in a time period of 1 year or less. And yet, especially for leaders and senior leaders in organizations, there are decisions that they're going to make on a monthly, a quarterly, or annual basis that have potentially years or decades of impact. And so therefore it would make sense that they should be thinking in that bigger time frame, thinking longer term that potentially they're encouraged to do. Now, our response to this often in organizations is to implement some type of an ad hoc solution. We notice that people aren't quite thinking big enough, and so we do some strategic thinking skills training, or potentially we do a trend identification workshop. And I often get brought in to do these things. I feel a little bit frustrated because I know that this is not going to really shift the needle, because we're implementing an ad hoc solution to what is actually a structural problem. And the way that we really need to go about this is to actually think about, what does a structural solution look like? What are the types of activities that we can build into the planning cycle that occur on an annual basis that actually encourage people to lift their gaze, rise themselves out of the operational work, and actually focus on the big picture and the strategic. And since writing this post, I also identified that this challenge doesn't exist just when we talk about strategic thinking. In fact, it's actually really common. So we often have a situation potentially of, our staff feeling overworked and burnt out. And our solution to that is to give them a free bowl of fruit or some yoga classes, instead of actually just hiring the additional workers that we need. Potentially we have issues around silos in organizations. And rather than looking at the structural issues around misaligned incentives for the different groups work with, we do something around kind of teamwork or bonding experiences to get people to communicate better, not realizing that as soon as that session is over, the structural problem remains and has yet to be addressed. Interestingly, when I was thinking through this idea, I came across something that was very front and center for me when I was working at Rio Tinto a few years ago, which was around this kind of the hierarchy of controls when we talk about safety. As you can imagine, in mining companies, safety is a big thing. And so at Rio, we were very familiar with this concept called the hierarchy of controls. And there's better and worse controls that we can have when we're faced with a safety issue. At the bottom of the hierarchy is PPE, so personal protective equipment. And only slightly above that is administrative controls. So what we're saying in this situation is we're not fundamentally removing the problem. We're not actually creating a structural response. We're just saying, hey, here's something to make you I can feel a little bit safer. At the top of the hierarchy is these kind of engineered outcomes. We get to the point where can we actually eliminate the structural problem in the first place, the risk in the first place? Can we substitute it for something else? These are much bigger and bolder initiatives, but they're actually fundamentally about removing those types of challenges for us, or creating a structural response to a structural problem. And so I suppose my question for you is, potentially, where else are you seeing in your life and your work structural problems? And where are we perhaps treating them as if they were discrete, treating them as if they're one-offs, treating them as if they can be solved with an ad hoc solution? One other thing that comes to mind when I think about this is our response to kind of floods and the use of sandbags. Like effectively, ad hoc solutions are like the sandbags that we're using to hold back the flood. I mean, they may help us in the moment, but it's not a long term solution. If we actually live in a flood zone, we need to start thinking about how do we build our houses differently. That's a structural response. So I'll throw this back to you again in a second. You're going to have 5 minutes of silence. Give you time to kind of contemplate and ruminate over this type of question. Of course, if you don't want to listen to that, you're welcome to fast forward to the end. But the thing that I'd love you to ruminate, or the thing I'd like you to think about in that 5 minutes is, where are there structural problems in your life and your work? And are you sometimes trying to solve those with ad hoc solutions? And what would a structural solution look like? What would it involve to implement it? And what might the alternate outcomes be? Over to you.